Have you ever walked into a place where every eye judged you before you spoke? Where your worn boots and rusted truck told them everything they thought they needed to know? That's where this started. The Lubbock Regional Livestock Auction sat under a June sun that had no mercy, the kind of heat that made asphalt shimmer and turned breath into something you had to work for. 200 ranchers filled the metal building, their trucks parked in neat rows outside dually diesels with paint jobs that caught the light chrome bumpers without a scratch. Windows so clean you could see your reflection judging you back. Robert Williams stood near the back wall, 49 years old, with sun-weathered white skin that mapped every drought and every loss. His Ford F-150 sat 3 rows out, the 1998 model with rust holes eating through the wheel wells and a check engine light that had been on so long he'd stopped noticing. 312,000 miles on the odometer. The driver's door didn't open from the outside anymore. He had $1,875 in his shirt pocket. Every bill represented something sold, something gone. 30 laying hens at the farmer's market. 3 market hogs to a buyer in plain view who didn't ask questions. The money sat against his chest in a worn envelope, and it felt like carrying a lie. $1,800 when you owed $38,000 was like showing up to a gunfight with a pocket knife. The auctioneer's voice crackled through speakers mounted in the corners, calling lot numbers with the rhythm of a man who'd done this 10,000 times. Registered Black Angus heifers went for $5,000, $6,000, $8,000. Breeding bulls with pedigrees longer than the Bible sold for numbers Robert couldn't wrap his head around. These weren't farmers. They were ranchers, the kind who measured land in sections instead of acres, who talked about cattle the way stockbrokers talked about portfolios. Robert shifted his weight, feeling the eyes slide over him. Faded Wrangler jeans with frayed cuffs, a blue work shirt washed so many times the color had surrendered. Boots he'd owned 7 years, the leather cracked across the toe box soles, worn smooth enough to slip on concrete. The straw hat on his head was a birthday gift from Catherine, back when birthdays still meant something. 6 years. She'd been gone 6 years, and some mornings he still woke up expecting to smell coffee brewing, to hear her humming while she moved through the kitchen. Pancreatic cancer didn't care about timelines or fairness. 8 months from diagnosis to grave. 8 months of watching the woman who'd planted that yellow poplar tree in the backyard waste away into someone he barely recognized, her voice getting smaller, her hands getting cold. The ranch felt too big without her. 640 acres of West Texas panhandle that used to hold 95 head of cattle back when rain fell and grass grew, and the world made sense. Now, 18 Black Angus crosses grazed pasture so thin you could count the bare patches from the porch. The pond his grandfather had dug in 1952 showed 70% dried mud. 3 years of drought had turned the land into something that looked like punishment. Robert pulled the envelope from his pocket, counted the bills for the 3rd time that morning. $1,575 from the poultry and hogs. 300 more that Edward Harris had pressed into his hand at dawn, the old man's fingers shaking with Parkinson's, but his voice steady. "Take it, Rob, whatever you need today." Edward knew what it felt like to lose a place. He'd buried his own ranch 5 years back. Same bank, same story. 1875 total. The math was simple and brutal. A decent breeding cow started at $3,000. A registered heifer went for $5 minimum. Robert had enough money to buy half of nothing. The auctioneer called Lot 47. Robert almost missed it. He'd been watching a group of ranchers near the front, men in their 50s and 60s, wearing shirts with pearl snaps and watches that cost more than his truck. They were laughing about something, shoulders shaking, phones out. The kind of laughter that had edges. Mixed breed cow approximately 4 years old. Owner surrender. The auctioneer's voice carried less enthusiasm than it had for the registered stock. The starting bid is $500. Do I hear 500? Silence filled the space where bids should have been. Robert moved closer to get a better look. The cow stood in a small pen separated from the main holding area, and the first thing he noticed was her ribs. Not the suggestion of ribs under a healthy coat, but ribs that jutted out like fence posts, each one visible and countable. Hip bones protruded at angles that looked wrong. Her legs trembled with the effort of standing. The coat that should have been glossy brown was dull and patchy, missing hair in spots that showed pale skin underneath. 400! The auctioneer tried again. Anyone for 400. More phones came out. A man in an expensive Stetson held his up, recording his face, split with a grin. Look at the state of that poor wretch. She's not even good for soap. That thing's still breathing. Another voice, younger, disbelieving. Someone tell me who brought this scrap metal here? Is this an auction or a junkyard? The laughter spread like spilled water, soaking into every corner of the building. 15-20 phones now all pointed at the skeletal cow in the pen. She stood with her head down, eyes half closed, too exhausted even to react to the noise. The trembling in her legs worsened. $300. The auctioneer sounded tired. Do I hear 300? Robert stepped closer to the pen, close enough to see her eyes clearly now. Large and brown, deep as a well that had run dry years ago. Something in those eyes grabbed hold of his chest and squeezed. He'd seen that look before in his own bathroom mirror every morning for the past 6 years. The exhaustion that went bone deep, the giving up that happened so slowly you didn't notice until you were drowning in it. The cow lifted her head slightly as if the movement cost her everything. She looked directly at Robert, and time did something strange. The auction noise faded to background static. The laughter became distant. In that moment, standing 3 feet from a dying animal that nobody wanted, Robert understood something he couldn't put into words. This cow was him. $200. The auctioneer's voice pulled him back. Final call, folks. $200 for this female. A man next to Robert elbowed his friend. 200, I wouldn't give 20. That's just coyote bait. Robert's hand went up before his brain caught up with the decision. The movement felt automatic, like his arm belonged to someone else. Someone who still believed in things that made no sense. The auctioneer stopped mid-sentence, staring. You bidding, sir. The words came out steadier than they had any right to be. I am. 200. Silence crashed through the building, different from before. This wasn't the silence of no interest. This was shock, the kind that turned heads and stopped conversations mid-word. 200 faces swiveled toward the man in the faded shirt and worn boots, the one with the rusted truck, the one who'd just done something everyone could agree was the dumbest decision they'd witnessed all day. 200 to the gentleman in the back. The auctioneer recovered, falling back into rhythm. Do I hear 250? Anyone want to go? 250? Nothing. 225. 210. The silence held. Sold. Lot 47. $200 to the gentleman in the straw hat. The laughter returned louder now, fed by disbelief. "Congratulations, pal! You just bought a corpse that still breathes. Take her home and bury her quick. It's cheaper than feeding her." Robert walked to the pen office, pulled $200 from his envelope, and watched the bills disappear into the cash box. The clerk handed him a receipt without making eye contact, the kind of professional distance people used when they thought you'd made a mistake too big to comment on. Outside, the afternoon heat hit like walking into an oven. Robert found an auction worker leaning against the fence, a kid maybe 20 with sweat stains under his arms and dust coating his jeans. "Need help loading her." The kid looked at the skeletal cow, then at Robert, then back at the cow. "You know, she probably won't survive the trip, right?" Robert stared at the animal standing in the pen, her breathing labored, her eyes closed again. "I know, but I'm going to try." "Why?" The question sat in the air between them, simple and impossible to answer. Robert thought about Catherine's grave under the yellow poplar, thought about the bank letter sitting on his kitchen table with numbers that didn't add up to anything except loss, thought about $38,000 in debt, and 30 days until they took everything his father had built, everything his grandfather had fenced, because sometimes you just have to believe in something, even when everyone else tells you it's not worth it. The kid didn't respond. He helped Robert rig a temporary ramp from scrap wood, and together they coaxed the cow toward the truck. She moved like every step, hurt hooves dragging legs threatening to give out. Getting her into the truck bed took 20 minutes. When she finally lay down on the rubber mat Robert had thrown in there, her whole body seemed to deflate with relief. Robert climbed into the cab, cranked the engine that coughed twice before catching, and pulled out of the parking lot. In the rearview mirror, he could see the cow's eyes were open again, staring up at the sky like she was memorizing it. The 2-hour drive back to Redford passed in segments measured by worry. Every 20 minutes, Robert pulled to the shoulder and walked around to check if she was still breathing. Each time those brown eyes tracked his movement, watching as he approached, never flinching when he touched her bony flank. "Hang in there! We're almost there, talking to a cow." Catherine would have smiled at that, the corner of her mouth quirking up the way it did when he did something foolish and sweet at the same time. She'd always believed in rescue missions, in second chances, in the idea that value lived in places most people couldn't see. She'd married him, after all, when he was 24, with nothing but a mortgaged ranch and calloused hands. The sun hung lower by the time Robert turned onto the dirt road that led home. Dust plume behind the truck grasshoppers launching themselves from the shoulder weeds, the familiar ruts and potholes he could navigate blind. The Williams Ranch appeared over the last rise white farmhouse that needed paint barn with a sagging roofline corrals empty, except for the main pasture where 18 cattle grazed in the distance. Jake sat on the porch steps, 12 years old, with his mother's dark hair and his father's serious eyes. He'd been waiting, legs swinging, face turned toward the road, like he'd spent the whole afternoon watching for the truck. When he spotted it approaching, he jumped up and started running. Robert parked near the small holding pen by the barn, the one they used for sick animals or new calves. Jake reached the truck before Robert even killed the engine, his sneakers kicking up dust, his hand already reaching for the tailgate latch. "Dad, you took forever. I was getting worried." Robert climbed out slowly, legs stiff from the drive back, protesting the way it always did lately. Jake had the tailgate down already, standing on the bumper to peer into the bed. "Dad, what is that?" The question came out quiet, not judgmental, but genuinely confused. Robert joined him at the tailgate, looking at the cow with his son's eyes. She was still in the same position, breathing visible through her pronounced ribs, eyes watching them both. "It's a cow. I know it's a cow, Dad." Jake struggled for the right words. "She's so thin. She looks sick. She's just weak. Been starved and neglected, but she'll get better." Jake turned to look at his father, and Robert saw the question forming behind his eyes, the serious look that had appeared the day Catherine died and never fully left. "Did you buy her at the auction?" "I did." For how much? Robert hesitated, then decided on truth. Jake deserved that much. 200. Silence, while Jake processed this. His young face worked through calculations Robert knew too well. Were the other animals at the sale expensive, real expensive? And she was the cheapest one. She was. Another silence, longer this time. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of dry grass and dust. A crow called from the oak tree Catherine had loved. Jake looked at the cow, then at his father, then back at the cow. "Why'd you buy her, Dad?" The question landed heavy. Robert could have given a dozen practical answers, all of them lies. Instead, he told the truth, because nobody else was going to. And if nobody bought her, she was going to die. She'd die alone with nobody giving a damn, and I just couldn't let that happen. Jake stayed quiet for a long moment, studying his father's face. Then he turned and started unlatching the tailgate completely. "Well, let's get her out of there then. She needs water and feed." Pride hit Robert sideways, unexpected and sharp. "Yes, son, let's do it." Getting the cow from the truck to the ground took patience and 2 car jacks as a makeshift ramp. She stood on solid earth, with legs wobbling, testing the dirt like she couldn't believe she'd arrived somewhere. Robert took the lead rope the auction had provided and guided her slowly toward the hospital pen. Jake walked on the other side, quiet and careful, adjusting his pace to match hers. The hospital pen sat near the house, shaded by an old oak that Catherine had planted their first year married. The tree had grown massive branches, spreading wide enough to cover half the pen. A water trough waited there, and Robert had filled it that morning out of hope, more than expectation. The cow saw the water and stopped. She stared at it like she didn't trust what her eyes showed her. Robert stepped closer, his voice low. "Go ahead. That's all yours." She lowered her head slowly, cautiously, and began to drink. The sound of it filled the evening quiet, long pulls, desperate and deep. She drank for so long, Robert started to worry. Too much water too fast could kill an animal this far gone. "That's enough." He nudged her away gently. "You can have more later, slow and easy." She let out a weak protest, a low sound that barely qualified as a moo, but allowed him to lead her away. Robert went to the feed bunk and dumped in chopped alfalfa, mixed with sweet feed, the last of what he had. The cow ate slowly, chewing with care, each mouthful deliberate. When she finished, she did something that stopped Robert's breath. She walked straight to him and rested her head against his chest. Just stood there, eyes closed, her weight pressing into him, her breath soaking warm through his shirt. Robert froze, hands hovering, not knowing what to do with them. Finally, he placed one palm on her neck, feeling the prominent bones, the tremor that ran through her exhausted body. Jake watched from the fence, silent. When the cow finally pulled away and went to lie down in the oak's shade, Robert realized his eyes were stinging. "Dad," Jake's voice came soft. "I think she's saying thank you." Robert wiped his face with the back of his hand, tried to keep his voice steady. "I reckon so, son." That night, sleep refused to come. Robert lay in the bedroom he'd shared with Catherine for 23 years, staring at ceiling shadows cast by moonlight through the window. The empty space beside him felt bigger than it had in months. He kept doing the math over and over, like repetition might change the outcome. Debt, $38,000. Money in hand after buying the cow, $1,675. Days until the bank took the property, 30. The letter sat downstairs on the kitchen table, where he'd left it, official letterhead from Redford Community Bank. Mr. Robert Williams, this is to inform you that payment in full is required by August 15th, 2024. Failure to satisfy the outstanding balance will result in foreclosure proceedings. Gary Young had signed it, the bank manager who'd gone to high school with Catherine. Young had called twice after sending the letter, his voice apologetic but firm. "My hands are tied, Rob. Head office wants the property. There's talk of development." Development, a clean word for erasing 3 generations of Williams family history and replacing it with whatever corporate entity saw profit in 640 acres of drought-punished land. Robert got out of bed, pulled on jeans and boots, walked downstairs in the dark. The coffee pot waited on the stove, the old percolator Catherine had used every morning. He filled it without turning on lights, muscle memory, guiding his hands, and started the gas burner. While water heated, he moved to the window. Moonlight painted the ranch in silver and shadow. He could see the hospital pen from here, the oak tree's broad canopy, and underneath it, the dark shape of the cow lying in the dirt. She'd shifted position, but hadn't gotten up since lying down 3 hours ago. Dr. Kenneth Taylor's voice echoed in Robert's head from the phone call he'd made before the auction. "I can come look at her when you get back, Rob, but I'm telling you straight, a cow in that condition you're looking at maybe 1 chance in 10, she makes it through the week. Could go tonight, could go tomorrow. Hard to say." The coffee started percolating, filling the kitchen with its bitter smell. Robert poured a cup, walked out to the porch in his bare feet. The June night carried a chill that seemed wrong for summer, the kind of cold that came from air too dry to hold heat. Stars scattered across the sky in patterns he'd memorized as a boy. The Big Dipper hung low. Orion had rotated below the horizon. Catherine used to sit out here with him on nights like this, back when their biggest worry was whether the hay would hold through winter. She'd lean against his shoulder, her weight familiar and right, and they'd talk about nothing and everything, plans for expanding the herd, which colleges the kids might attend, whether they should finally fix the barn roof or let it ride another year. The barn roof still sagged. The herd had shrunk from 95 to 18. Laura was in nursing school in Dallas, drowning in student loans they couldn't help with. Jake was 12 and too serious carrying weight no kid should carry. And Catherine was 6 years in the ground under a yellow poplar that bloomed every spring, whether anyone was there to see it or not. Robert sipped his coffee bitter and strong and made himself look at the truth. He'd spent $200 they couldn't afford on a cow that would probably die. He'd done it because something in her eyes had spoken to something in him, and that wasn't a reason that would impress a bank manager or save a ranch. That was just sentiment, and sentiment didn't pay bills, but what nobody in that room knew was what she carried inside. Not just life, hope. The words felt true, even though Robert didn't understand them yet. He drained his coffee, set the cup on the porch railing, and walked out to the hospital pen in the dark. The cow lifted her head when she heard him approach. Those brown eyes caught the moonlight reflecting it back like still water. Robert opened the gate, moved to where she lay, and sat down in the dirt beside her. "I don't know what I'm doing." His voice came out quiet, meant for himself as much as her. "I don't know how to save this place, don't know how to make the money appear, don't know how to keep the promise I made to my wife." The cow watched him listening, or not listening, he couldn't tell. Robert leaned back against the oak's trunk, feeling the rough bark through his shirt. Above them stars wheeled across the sky, indifferent and eternal. "You called for me earlier, didn't you? When you put your head on my chest, you knew I'd come." She didn't answer, obviously. She was just a cow. But something in the way she looked at him made Robert feel there was more than instinct at work. There was recognition, trust, maybe even understanding. He stayed there until dawn, sitting in the dirt, while the cow slept and the stars faded and the eastern horizon began to glow. When the sun finally broke the edge of the world, painting everything gold and pink, Robert stood up stiff and sore. The cow watched him go. "It's going to be okay." The words felt like prayer. "You're going to make it. We're going to make it." Walking back to the house, Robert wanted to believe his own words. Wanted to believe that spending $200 on a dying animal wasn't the final stupid decision in a long series of stupid decisions. But belief required evidence, and all he had was hope. The next 7 days established a rhythm that pushed everything else to the edges. Robert woke at 4:30 each morning, made coffee, walked out to the pen. Feed Grace. That's what Jake had named her on day 3, and the name had stuck. Water her. Check her breathing, her eyes, the way she moved or didn't move. By day 5, she was standing on her own without trembling. By day 7, she was grazing on the pasture grass Robert had let grow long in the pen, pulling up tufts with determination that made him smile for the first time in weeks. Jake helped before and after school, his summer break not starting for another week. He'd sit in the pen and talk to Grace like she was a person, telling her about his classes and his teachers and the kids who made fun of his clothes. "Miss Grace, you know what happened today. Trent Morrison called me poor farm trash in front of everyone, but I didn't say nothing back. You know why. Because people who judge what they don't understand, they're the ones with the problem, not us." Robert listened from the barn, chest tight with pride and anger both. Jake had learned that particular lesson too young, learned it the way you learn anything in a small town when your family slides from comfortable to struggling to desperate. The Williams name used to mean something in Redford. Now it meant unpaid feed store tabs and whispers. On day 8, Laura called from Dallas. Her voice came through the phone line, tired, stressed, the sound of someone juggling too much. "Dad, I need to tell you something." Robert braced himself for bad news, his standard reaction to phone calls. "What's wrong, honey?" "Nothing's wrong. I've been thinking maybe I should come home for the summer, help out. I could get a job in Plainview, maybe at the hospital." "No." "But, Dad, you stay in Dallas. You finish your summer classes. You become a nurse. We need the money. We'll manage." Laura went quiet for a moment, and Robert could picture her face, the way her forehead wrinkled when she was trying not to cry. "You sound different. What's going on?" "Nothing. Just tired." "You're lying. I can always tell." Robert looked out the kitchen window at Grace grazing in the pen, her coat already starting to show hints of shine, her movements less labored. "I bought a cow. A cow at an auction. She was half dead. Nobody wanted her." He paused, searching for words. "I brought her home." Another silence, longer this time. Then Laura's voice came back softer. "Mom would have done the same thing." The words hit Robert in a place he'd thought had gone numb. "Yeah, she would have." They talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, the kind of conversation designed to avoid topics that hurt. When they hung up, Robert stood holding the dead phone, thinking about Catherine and yellow poplar trees and promises that felt impossible to keep. On day 10, everything changed. Robert was feeding Grace her morning meal, watching her eat with an appetite that had returned strong. The sun climbed above the horizon, turning the sky from pink to blue. Grace had gained weight, not much, but enough to notice. Her ribs still showed, but muscles had started to fill in underneath. Her coat had lost its dull, patchy quality. He was reaching for the water hose when he noticed her belly. At first Robert thought it was bloat, common enough in animals that starve and then overeat. But the shape was wrong. Bloat spread evenly. This bulged on one side, asymmetrical and strange. Robert stepped closer, studying it. Grace stood still, chewing her cud, unconcerned. Robert placed his hand on her right flank, fingers spread, feeling for anything unusual. Her skin was warm, the hair soft under his palm. He waited, not sure what he was looking for. Then it happened. A kick. Small, distinct, unmistakable. Movement under his hand that came from inside Grace's body, something alive and separate from her. Robert's hand jerked back like he'd touched fire. His breath stopped in his chest. His brain stuttered, trying to process what he'd felt. He put his hand back, pressing gently against the same spot. Waited. Another kick, stronger this time. Then another, life moving under his palm, announcing itself, refusing to be ignored. Robert stumbled backward, legs suddenly weak. He sat down hard in the dirt of the pen, staring at Grace, who continued chewing like nothing significant had happened. The world tilted, rearranged itself, showed him a reality he hadn't seen coming. Grace was pregnant. The skeletal cow from the auction, the one everyone laughed at, the one they called carcass and scrap metal and waste of space. She was carrying a calf. Had been carrying it the whole time, through starvation, through neglect, through the humiliation of that pen, while phones recorded her and voices mocked her, and nobody saw what she protected inside. Robert's hands shook as he pulled his phone from his pocket, scrolled through contacts, hit the number for Dr. Kenneth Taylor. The vet answered on the third ring, his voice gravelly from sleep. "This better be good, Rob. It's 6:30 in the morning. Doc, I need you out here. Now." "What's wrong?" "Is it the cow?" "She's pregnant." Silence. Then, "You sure I felt it kick?" "Multiple times." "She's pregnant, Doc." Taylor's voice shifted, losing its sleepy edge. "I'll be there in an hour. Don't do anything until I get there." Robert hung up, shoved the phone back in his pocket, looked at Grace. She'd stopped chewing and was watching him now, those calm brown eyes that seemed to understand more than they should. Robert stood up, walked over to her, placed both hands on her neck. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out as a whisper, rhetorical and sincere, both. "All this time, all this suffering, you were protecting something." Grace lowered her head, rested it against his chest, the way she had that first night. The gesture that had become their language, the way she said, "Thank you and trust, and I know you'll take care of me." Robert stood there in the June morning sunlight, holding a pregnant cow nobody had wanted, and felt something he hadn't felt in 6 years. Possibility. Dr. Kenneth Taylor pulled into the ranch at 7:45, his white truck kicking up dust on the long driveway. He climbed out with his leather medical bag, 65 years old, with gray hair and glasses that sat crooked on his face. Robert met him at the pen. "Show me." Robert led him to Grace, explained what he'd felt and where. Taylor set his bag down, rolled up his sleeves, began a methodical examination. He palpated her abdomen, listened with a stethoscope, made her walk back and forth while he watched her gait. 30 minutes of checking and rechecking. Finally, Taylor straightened up, took off his glasses, wiped them on his shirt. His thinking gesture, the one he'd used for 40 years of veterinary practice. Robert waited, heart hammering against his ribs. "Rob." Taylor's voice came careful, measured. "This cow isn't just pregnant." Robert's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" Taylor pointed to Grace's belly, tracing patterns in the air. "Based on the size, the positioning, what I can feel she's carrying, twins." The words didn't make sense at first. Robert's brain tried to process them, kept hitting obstacles. "Twins." "In a cow I bought for $200, a cow nobody wanted twins." Taylor nodded. "And looking at her development, I'd say she's about 7 months along. 2 more months and those calves are coming." Robert leaned against the fence, needing support. The numbers started arranging themselves in his head, showing him possibilities he'd been too scared to imagine. How much would twin calves be worth? Taylor scratched his jaw, considering. "That depends. These aren't just any calves, Rob. Look at her frame, the udder structure, even as thin as she is. This cow has high-grade dairy genetics. I'm guessing Holstein Jersey cross, maybe some imported bloodlines. And that means if these calves are born healthy, especially if they're heifers, they could be worth serious money. Dairy genetics like this are in high demand." He paused. "Healthy twin heifers with the genetics, I think she has 15 to 20,000 each, maybe more, depending on the buyer." Robert's legs gave out completely. He slid down the fence until he was sitting in the dirt, staring at nothing, trying to breathe. 15 to 20,000 each. If they were both heifers, that was $30,000 to $40,000, almost exactly what he owed the bank. Jake appeared from the direction of the house, running his backpack, bouncing against his shoulders. He'd heard the vet's truck, came to see what was happening. He skidded to a stop at the pen, looked at his father, sitting in the dirt, looked at Dr. Taylor, standing with his arms crossed, looked at Grace, watching them all calmly. "What's wrong?" Robert found his voice, though it came out rough. "Nothing's wrong, son. Grace is pregnant with twins." Jake's eyes went wide. "Twins? Like 2 calves, that's right." Taylor smiled. "Your dad just found out he's got 2 miracles waiting to be born." But Jake was smart, too smart for his age. His face shifted from wonder to calculation. "When are they due?" 2 months, give or take." Taylor's smile faded. "Late August, early September. The bank deadline is August 15th. Jake said it quiet, stating fact. The calves will be born after they take the ranch." Nobody spoke. The truth sat there among them, undeniable. Robert had miracles growing inside. A cow nobody had wanted, worth enough money to save everything, and they'd arrive 2 weeks too late. Dr. Taylor left at 9 that morning with instructions that made Robert's stomach turn. Premium alfalfa at $80 a week. Protein supplements another $45. Twice monthly vet visits at $150 each. The math added up to $800 monthly for a cow carrying calves that might save the ranch or might arrive too late to matter. Robert stood in the barn after the vet's truck disappeared down the road, calculator in hand, running numbers that refused to cooperate. $1,675 in cash after buying Grace, minus $800 for her first month of care, left $875. Another month would drain him completely. The bank deadline sat 51 days out. The calves needed 60, maybe more. Jake appeared in the barn doorway, backpack still on late for school. His face carried that serious expression Robert had learned to recognize, the look of a kid working through adult problems with a child's limited toolkit. We can't afford what Doc Taylor said, can we? Robert considered lying, decided against it. Jake deserved honesty, had earned it through 6 years of living in a house where grief took up more space than furniture. No, son, we can't. Then what do we do? The question hung between them, unanswerable. Robert clicked the calculator off, shoved it in his pocket. We figure it out. Like always. Jake shifted his weight, chewing his lower lip, the way Catherine used to when she was thinking. I have $140, birthday money from Grandma Harris. You can have it. The offer landed like a punch. Robert's throat closed up, words sticking there. He shook his head, couldn't trust his voice. Dad, I'm serious. Grace needs it more than I need a new bike. Robert walked over, pulled his son into a hug that neither of them pulled away from. When he finally found words, they came out rough. Okay, thank you. Jake's birthday money bought 3 weeks of supplements. The rest, Robert scraped together, selling the last of Catherine's chickens, the ones she'd raised from chicks, the ones that laid brown eggs she'd been so proud of. $42 for 8 hens. The feed store owner, Mrs. Patricia Morrison, counted out bills with hands that trembled slightly, her voice soft. I'm sorry about all this, Rob. Robert took the money pocketed. It didn't respond. Sorry, didn't pay for antibiotics or buy back time. The Redford Community Bank sat on Main Street between the hardware store and the defunct movie theater that had closed in 2019. Robert parked his truck in the shade of a dying elm and walked inside, hat in hand, playing a role he'd never imagined for himself, the desperate man begging for mercy. Gary Young's office occupied the back corner glass walls, giving him a view of the whole building. He saw Robert coming, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite guilt, not quite pity. Something in between. Rob, come in. Sit down. The chair across from Young's desk had been sat in by how many others over the years? How many farmers and ranchers and small business owners, all of them wearing the same desperate expression, all of them holding the same doomed hope that somehow the numbers would change? Robert stayed standing. I need to talk to you about the deadline. Young leaned back, fingers steepled. The deadline is August 15th. That hasn't changed. I know what the deadline is, but circumstances have changed. The cow I bought, she's pregnant, with twins, high-value dairy genetics. Robert heard himself talking too fast, words tumbling over each other. If I can just get an extension to September 1st, I can sell the calves and pay everything. The full 38,000, maybe more. Gary Young didn't respond immediately. He pulled Robert's file from a drawer, opened it, scanned pages he'd probably read 100 times. When he looked up, his face had gone professional, the practiced neutrality of a man delivering bad news he'd delivered before. I tried Rob. After we talked last month, I went to the head office, told them about your family's history with the bank, 3 generations of Williams men who never missed a payment until the drought hit. I made the case for another extension, and they said no. Young closed the file. They want the property. There's talk of commercial development, shopping center, maybe a hotel. The location's valuable, they said, more valuable than letting another small ranch struggle through. The words hit Robert like physical blows. They wanted his land not because he'd failed, but because they could profit from his failure. The ranch his grandfather had bought in 1947, the land his father had worked until a stroke took him at 62, the place where Catherine had planted that yellow poplar, all of it reduced to square footage and market value. So that's it? There's nothing I can do? Pay the full balance by August 15th. Young's voice carried something that might have been sympathy. That's the only option. Robert left the bank without another word, climbed into his truck, sat there, staring at nothing. Through the windshield downtown, Redford looked exactly as it always had. Feed store, post office diner, where Catherine used to order coffee and pie. But everything felt different now, tainted by the knowledge that he was about to lose his place in it. Edward Harris showed up that afternoon, his old Chevy rattling up the drive at 3 o'clock. He climbed out slowly, Parkinson's making his hands shake, but his eyes were sharp. He found Robert in the barn, replacing boards in a stall that didn't need replacing, burning off frustration with physical work. Heard you went to the bank. News traveled fast in small towns. Robert hammered another nail harder than necessary. Yeah, they give you the extension? No. Edward leaned against a support post, watching Robert work. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of experience of having stood exactly where Robert stood now. I lost my place 5 years back. Same bank, same manager even. You know what the hardest part was? Robert stopped hammering, waited. The hope. Edward's hands shook worse when he got emotional. Right up until the day they put the padlock on my gate, I kept thinking something would change, that I'd find the money somehow, that they'd have mercy. The hope was worse than the losing. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to decide what you're fighting for. If it's the land, then you do whatever it takes and you don't think about the cost. If it's your pride, you're already beat. Edward pushed off from the post. And if it's that cow out there, the one everyone laughed at, the one carrying miracles nobody saw coming, then you feed her what she needs, and you trust the timing's going to work out even when the math says different. Robert set down his hammer, looked at the old man who'd lost everything and somehow survived it. How do I trust the timing when the calves come after the deadline? Same way you trusted putting $200 on a dying cow. Edward smiled, sad and knowing. You just do. Grace's care became a religion. Robert practiced with devotional intensity. Every morning at 5, he mixed her feed with exact measurements: 2 cups premium alfalfa pellets, 1 cup sweet feed, ½ cup protein, supplement, mineral block access. Water changed twice daily, tested for temperature. The pen cleaned every afternoon, fresh bedding spread. He tracked her weight gain in a notebook 3 pounds the first week after the pregnancy discovery, 5 the second, 7 the third. Jake helped before school and after talking to Grace about his day while Robert worked. Miss Grace, you know what Mr. Henderson said in math class? He said, compound interest is what makes poor people poorer and rich people richer. Then he looked right at me when he said it, like he knew. Robert paused in spreading fresh straw, anger flaring hot. Mr. Henderson said that, not exactly, but I could tell what he meant. Jake sat cross-legged in the dirt Grace's head, lowering to nuzzle his hair. It's okay, though. I don't care what he thinks. But Robert cared that his son had to endure teachers who judged him for circumstances beyond his control, cared that poverty had become a mark that followed them everywhere, to school, to the feed store, to church, where people smiled and asked how they were doing with voices that already knew the answer. July 10th arrived with heat that made the air shimmer, temperatures climbing past 100 by noon. Robert found Grace at 2 in the afternoon, standing in the shade, but breathing hard, her body radiating fever heat. He didn't need a thermometer to know something was wrong. The call to Dr. Taylor brought him out within the hour. The examination took 15 minutes. The diagnosis came quick and brutal: uterine infection. Taylor's face was grim. The pregnancy's putting stress on her system, and her body's fighting back. We need to start antibiotics immediately, or we'll lose all 3 of them. How much? $180 for the medication, another $50 for the administration. Taylor paused. I can bill you if Robert shook his head. He had $212 in his wallet money from selling tools he'd owned 20 years. I'll pay now. The injection went into Grace's flank, a large dose that made her flinch. Taylor showed Robert how to administer follow-up doses over the next 5 days. Keep her cool, push fluids, watch for fever spikes. If she goes down and won't get up, call me immediately. That night, Grace's temperature climbed into 104.6. She lay in the pen, refusing to eat, her breathing shallow and rapid. Robert sat beside her with wet towels, pressing them to her neck, her flanks, anywhere he could reach. The moon rose full and bright stars appearing one by one, the universe indifferent to a sick cow and a desperate man. You're going to make it. Robert's voice came steady, even though his hands shook. You've come too far to quit now. Grace's eyes stayed closed, her body trembling with fever. Robert kept applying wet towels, kept talking, kept believing, because the alternative was unthinkable. Laura's car pulled into the ranch at 11 that night, headlights cutting through the dark engine noise, startling Robert from half-sleep. He'd been dozing against the oak tree, towel in hand, Grace's fever finally starting to break. Laura climbed out of her 10-year-old Honda Facet with determination. He recognized Catherine's stubbornness living on in their daughter. What are you doing here? You have summer classes. I withdrew. Laura pulled a duffel bag from the back seat. Drove straight through. 6 hours. Laura, you can't just... She cut him off, walking straight to where he sat. How much do you have in the bank right now? The question caught him sideways. I don't see how that's... How much, Dad? $873. Laura reached into her bag, pulled out an envelope, handed it to him. Inside $850 in 20s and 50s money that smelled like it had come straight from an ATM. Robert stared at it. That's your tuition money. Was my tuition money. Now it's Grace's antibiotic money and feed money and whatever else. She needs money. Laura's voice cracked slightly. This is our home. Mom's grave is 50 yards from where we're standing. I'm not letting some bank take it because we're $800 short. Robert tried to hand the envelope back. I can't accept this. You don't have a choice. Laura pushed his hand away. Grace needs it. The ranch needs it. We need it. She paused. Besides, I already withdrew. Can't get the tuition back now. The lie was obvious and loving. Robert pulled his daughter into a hug that lasted until they were both crying silently, holding on to each other, and the hope that $850 could buy them enough time for miracles to arrive. Grace's fever broke on July 13th at dawn. Robert woke to find her standing drinking water, her eyes clear for the first time in 3 days. The antibiotics had worked. Dr. Taylor arrived at 8 to check her progress, declared her out of danger, told Robert he'd seen recoveries before, but nothing quite like this. Her will to survive is something else. Taylor packed his stethoscope, clicked his bag shut. Most cows would have given up by now, but she keeps fighting because she knows what she's carrying. Robert watched Grace graze on fresh grass he'd cut and brought to her pen. She's protecting them. Maybe, Taylor smiled. Or maybe you gave her something to fight for. The town split on Grace's story. Edward brought hay he couldn't afford to spare. Mrs. Morrison at the feed store offered credit. Robert refused to take. The pastor mentioned the Williams family in Sunday prayers, calling them an example of faith during hardship. But others saw only foolishness, grown man spending money he didn't have on a cow that should have been sold for meat. Robert overheard the conversation at the Redford diner where he'd stopped for coffee he probably shouldn't have bought. Booth behind him, voices he didn't recognize, but accents that placed them as local. Heard Williams bought that skeleton cow from the Lubbock auction, pregnant with twins, supposedly. Supposedly being the key word, probably just bloat, even if their real calves don't come till September. Bank takes his place August 15th, so he spent $200 on a dying cow, and God knows how much keeping her alive all for nothing. That's not faith. That's stupidity. Robert left his coffee unfinished, paid at the counter, walked out. The judgment didn't surprise him. Small towns ran on gossip and the comfort of watching others fail. What surprised him was how little it hurt. Their opinions meant nothing compared to Grace standing in her pen, growing stronger each day, protecting 2 lives nobody else had valued. August 8th arrived with the weight of countdown clocks ticking toward midnight. 7 days until the bank deadline. Robert sat at the kitchen table at dawn coffee, growing cold, staring at the calendar he'd marked with X's through each passing day. 51 days had become 7. The impossible gap between now and when the calves would arrive had narrowed but not closed. Jake appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed, though school had been out for 6 weeks. You going to the bank again? No point. Robert drained his cold coffee, grimaced. They made their position clear. So what do we do? The question Jake kept asking, the one Robert still couldn't answer. Wait. Hope. Pray that Grace goes into labor early enough that we can sell the calves before they padlock the gate. Jake crossed to the window, looked out at the pen where Grace grazed in the early light. What if she doesn't? Go into labor early, I mean. Then we lose everything. Robert said it flat, no emotion stating fact. We pack what we can carry, and we leave. Where would we go? Dallas, maybe. Laura's there. I could find work. Construction, warehouse something. The words tasted like ash. We'd figure it out. Jake turned from the window, and Robert saw tears tracking down his son's face, silent and steady. I don't want to leave. This is where Mom is. The simple truth of it broke something in Robert. He stood, walked to his son, pulled him close. I know, buddy, I know. They stood there in the kitchen Catherine had cooked in for 23 years, holding on to each other while the sun climbed and the clock ticked, and 7 days shrank toward 6. August 10th arrived at 2:45 in the morning with a sound that pulled Robert from sleep, a low, urgent call from the pen, different from any noise Grace had made before. He was out of bed and running before full consciousness, caught up boots, unlaced shirt, unbuttoned, moving on instinct and fear. The pen gate stood open from his last check at midnight. Inside, Grace paced in tight circles. Her breathing labored her body, slick with sweat that reflected moonlight. When she saw Robert, she stopped and made that sound again, a moan that carried pain and plea both. Her water had broken. Fluid darkened the dirt beneath her, and even in moonlight Robert could see the contractions rippling through her distended belly. Too early. The calves weren't due for 3 more weeks, minimum, maybe 4. Premature births in cattle meant complications, meant calves too small to survive, meant losing everything they'd fought for. Robert ran back to the house, burst into Jake's room. Call doctor. Taylor, tell him Grace is in labor, now. Jake grabbed his phone, already dialing, as Robert sprinted back outside. Laura appeared from her room, pulled on jeans over her pajamas. What's happening? The calves are coming. They're not due yet. I know. Robert was already out the door, Laura following both of them, running toward the pen where Grace had gone down, lying on her side legs, thrashing. Dr. Taylor's voice came through Jake's phone speaker, groggy and alarmed. Keep her calm. I'm leaving now. 20 minutes. 20 minutes felt like hours. Robert knelt beside Grace, hands hovering uselessly, not knowing what to do or how to help. Her breathing came in gasps, each contraction visible as waves moving across her belly. Laura appeared with towels and a bucket of water, her nursing student training kicking in. We need to keep her clean. Infection risk is huge. The contractions intensified. Grace's moans became scream sounds that would haunt Robert's nightmares for years. 3:15, 3:30, 3:45. Each minute stretched impossibly long, filled with Grace's suffering and Robert's helplessness and the growing certainty that they were losing her. Dr. Taylor's truck roared up the drive at 4:20, tires spitting gravel. He grabbed his bag and ran to the pen, Laura already briefing him on vitals and timing. The examination took seconds. First calf is breech. Taylor's voice went clinical detached in the way medical professionals learn to be. I need to turn it or we lose them both. What followed was 90 minutes of something Robert would never forget and could never properly describe. Taylor, with his arm inside Grace, up to the shoulder face, contorted with effort, trying to turn a calf that didn't want to turn. Grace screaming. Laura holding flashlights with shaking hands. Robert murmuring constant reassurance that felt like lies. Come on, Grace. You can do this. You're strong, stronger than any of them knew. 450 brought breakthrough. Taylor's grunt of triumph, his arm withdrawing the sudden rush of fluid, and then the calf emerging in one slick motion, A heifer small and wet, weighing maybe 48 pounds, far below normal, but alive, breathing. Aurora. The name came from Laura, spoken soft, because she's born at dawn. Taylor cleared the calf's airways, placed her where Grace could reach. Despite her exhaustion, Grace lifted her head and began licking her daughter clean, the ancient instinct, stronger than pain or tiredness. Mother and child meeting for the first time. One down. Taylor's voice carried exhaustion. 1 to go. The second calf wasn't coming. 5:15, and Grace's contractions had weakened her body, giving up. Taylor checked again, his face going pale in the growing light. This one's in distress. Heartbeats dropping. Robert leaned close to Grace, his mouth near her ear. You have another baby that needs you. You can't stop now. One more push. Just one more. Grace's eyes were closing, her breathing shallow. Laura checked for pulse, her expression shifting to panic. Dad, I'm not finding a heartbeat. The words didn't make sense. Robert pressed his hand to Grace's chest, felt nothing, pressed harder, moved his hand, searched for the rhythm that had to be there. Nothing. 45 seconds of nothing. Grace's eyes fully closed, her body still. No! Robert's voice came out as a roar. Grace, wake up! Wake up! He slammed his palm against her flank, the sound sharp and violent. Again, a third time. Taylor was saying something about it being over, about doing what they could, but Robert couldn't hear him through the blood pounding in his ears. You don't get to quit. Not now. Not after everything. One more slam of his hand against her side, hard enough to hurt his palm. And then a gasp. Sudden and huge air rushing into lungs that had forgotten how. Grace's eyes flew open wild and unfocused. Her heart kicked back into rhythm beneath Robert's hand, strong and steady. Taylor stared. I've never seen that work. In 40 years, I've never. Grace's body contracted violently, the shock of revival triggering labor. Taylor moved into position, ready this time. Grace pushed with everything she had left, a final, monumental effort. 5:30, the sun cresting the horizon, painting the sky impossible colors. The second calf emerged into Taylor's waiting hands, another heifer, smaller than the first, maybe 41 pounds, with a visible deformity in her right front hoof, the leg twisted slightly inward, hoof clubbed and malformed, but breathing, alive, Star. Jake had come to the pen at some point, watching from the fence. Because of the mark on her forehead, a white patch star-shaped stood out against her brown coat. Taylor placed her next to Aurora, and Grace began licking this daughter, too, accepting both, loving both despite exhaustion that should have killed her. Robert sat back in the dirt hands, shaking shirt soaked with sweat and fluids he didn't want to identify. Laura collapsed beside him, tears streaming. Jake climbed into the pen and joined them, all three watching Grace tend to her newborns while the sun rose on August 10th and the impossible became real. Dr. Taylor examined both calves with gentle hands, checking airways, reflexes, temperatures. When he finished, he sat back and delivered the news with a veterinarian's practiced honesty. They're alive. That's the miracle, but they're premature and underweight. Aurora looks strong enough, good muscle tone, responsive. She'll probably be fine. Star, though, he pointed to the clubbed hoof, that's going to affect her value significantly. How significantly? 40, maybe 50% reduction. Dairy buyers want perfect confirmation. A clubfoot means she can't compete at shows, might have mobility issues, long term. Taylor pulled off his glasses, cleaned them despite having no cloth. I'd estimate Aurora at 18 to 20,000 if she stays healthy. Star maybe 8 to 10. Robert did the math automatically, the numbers arranging themselves in his head with brutal clarity. Aurora, 20,000. Star, 9,000 average. Total, 29,000. He needed 38,000, 9,000 short, and that assumed best-case scenarios, and buyers who didn't haggle. What about Grace? How much is she worth now? Taylor considered the cow lying exhausted, but alive. The cow who'd survived starvation and infection, and a birth that should have killed her. Recovered proven breeder, good genetics, maybe 3,000, 32,000 total. Still 6,000 short of the bank debt, and that assumed selling Grace too, which meant losing the cow who'd brought them this far. The bank deadline sat 5 days out. The calves needed at least a week to be strong enough to show buyers, probably 2 for Star to prove she could walk despite the deformity. The numbers refused to work no matter how Robert arranged them. Laura spoke first, her voice carrying forced optimism. What if we explain to buyers what Grace survived? Show them that these genetics are worth premium prices. Jake added his own thought, quieter but determined. And what we survived too. Robert looked at his children, at Grace with her newborn calves, at the sun climbing higher over land that might not be theirs in 5 days. He wanted to believe explanations would matter, that buyers would see value beyond paperwork and perfect confirmation. Wanted to believe miracles still had room to grow. But belief required evidence, and all he had were twin calves worth less than the debt they were meant to erase, born too early and too imperfect in a world that measured worth in dollars and wouldn't extend credit for hope. Dr. Taylor made the calls that afternoon while Grace nursed her newborn's phone pressed to his ear, voice carrying the practiced salesmanship of a man who'd brokered livestock deals for 40 years. Robert listened from the barn, catching fragments, high-grade, genetics, twin heifers, rare opportunity. 3 interested parties by evening. Appointments scheduled for August 13th, 9 in the morning. 3 days before the bank deadline. Robert spent August 11th in preparation. He couldn't afford to stop and examine too closely. If he thought about the math, 29,000 from the calves versus 38,000 owed, his hands would shake too badly to work. So he cleaned instead, scrubbed the barn until ancient wood showed grain patterns he'd forgotten existed, swept concrete that hadn't seen a broom in months, oiled hinges on gates that squeaked, physical labor to quiet the screaming in his head that said this wouldn't be enough. Jake worked beside him without being asked, carrying buckets and raking straw. His 12-year-old frame stretched thin from a growth spurt that had ambushed them both. The boy didn't talk much, just labored with the single-minded focus he'd developed since Catherine's death. Robert recognized the coping mechanism: stay busy, stay useful. Don't think about what you can't control. Laura handled the calves, her nursing student training translating into animal care with surprising ease. She monitored their temperatures every 4 hours, made notes in a spiral notebook about feeding times and behavior changes. Aurora had taken to nursing aggressively, gaining strength hour by hour. Star struggled more, the clubbed foot making it difficult to stand steady, but she persisted with a determination that reminded Robert painfully of her mother. By midnight on August 12th, the ranch looked better than it had in 3 years. The barn gleamed. The pen where Grace rested with Aurora and Star could have passed inspection at a breeding show. Every surface Robert could reach had been wiped, swept, or polished. He stood in the center of the barn at 1 in the morning, surveying work that felt simultaneously essential and futile. Laura found him there, her footsteps soft on concrete. "You should sleep." "Can't." The word came out honest, no pretense. "Every time I close my eyes, I run the numbers again." She moved to stand beside him, shoulder touching his, in shared exhaustion. "What if we're 9,000 short after the sale? Then we're 9,000 short." Robert kept his voice level. "We'll pack what matters and figure out the rest." Where would we go? The question everyone kept asking, the one Robert kept not answering because every answer felt like betrayal. Catherine was 50 yards from where they stood, buried under a tree she'd planted with her own hands. Leaving meant abandoning her, or at least that's how it felt in the dark hours before dawn, when honesty lived closest to the surface, somewhere with work. Dallas, maybe. Houston, somewhere I can earn enough to keep you in school and Jake fed. Laura leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture from childhood before she'd grown tall enough to meet his eyes. "I don't want somewhere else. I want here." "I know, honey." Robert's throat closed around the words. "I know." They stood together in the clean barn, surrounded by evidence of effort that might not matter until Laura finally trudged back to the house and Robert was alone with his thoughts and the sound of Grace's steady breathing from the pen. August 13th arrived with heat that made mirages dance on the highway. Robert woke at 5 after 3 hours of fractured sleep, showered in water that never got properly hot, dressed in the only button-down shirt he owned that didn't have frayed cuffs. The Wranglers he'd bought for Catherine's funeral still fit barely. Boots polished until the cracked leather showed almost shine. Jake appeared in clothes Robert hadn't known he owned: khakis that must have come from Laura's emergency run to Walmart, a polo shirt in blue that made him look older than 12. The boy had combed his hair with water, plastered it flat, in a style that would last maybe 20 minutes in the heat. "You look good, son." Jake tugged at the collar. "Feels weird. Presentations always do." Robert managed something close to a smile. "But we're selling more than calves today. We're selling a story." "What story?" "The story of a cow nobody wanted carrying. Calves nobody saw, surviving everything that should have killed her, producing genetics worth more than paperwork says." Robert paused. "The story of us not quitting." Laura joined them in the kitchen, wearing a sundress she'd brought from Dallas, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look professional, capable. She'd printed documents on the ancient inkjet printer in her old bedroom. Grace's weight gain charts, the calves' feeding schedules, Dr. Taylor's notes on probable bloodlines, information to support claims they couldn't prove. The first truck arrived at 8:55 early in a way that suggested either eagerness or the desire to unsettle them before negotiations began. A white dually Ford, pristine and expensive, towing nothing because men like this didn't transport their own livestock. The driver who emerged wore boots that cost more than Robert's monthly grocery budget and a Stetson shaped too perfectly to have seen actual ranch work. Donald Moore extended a hand, his grip firm in the calculated way of men who'd learned handshakes mattered. "Robert Williams, Dr. Taylor speaks highly of you. Appreciate you coming out." Robert released the handshake gestured toward the barn. The calves are this way. Two more vehicles arrived before they reached the pen, a gray Silverado carrying Stephen Scott, younger than Moore, maybe 45, with the lean build of someone who still worked his own land, and a silver SUV containing Rebecca Walker, 38, according to Dr. Taylor's briefing, representing a dairy co-op based in Amarillo. She carried a tablet and wore jeans that had actually been worn, not purchased, pre-distressed. The three buyers stood at the fence, silent, studying Aurora and Star with eyes that calculated value the way accountants calculated tax liability. Grace watched them back, positioned between her calves and the strangers in a posture Robert recognized as protective. Aurora stood strong, her 48 pounds having climbed to maybe 52 in the 3 days since birth. She nursed aggressively when Grace allowed, walked without stumbling, showed the vigor of a calf born under better circumstances. Star wobbled more, the clubbed foot creating a limp that couldn't be hidden, but she'd gained weight too, fought to keep up with her sister. Dr. Taylor handled the technical presentation, pointing out bone structure and udder conformation, and the subtle markers that suggested valuable genetics. The buyers listened, with faces that revealed nothing, asking questions. Taylor answered with the confidence of 4 decades' experience, but they keep coming back to the papers. Moore finally interrupted Taylor mid-explanation about butterfat percentages. What documentation do you have on the dam's lineage? None. Robert stepped forward before Taylor could soften the answer. She came from a surrender lot at the Lubbock auction. No history, no registration. So you're asking us to trust your word on genetics worth $20,000 per calf. Scott's voice carried skepticism without hostility, just business. I'm asking you to trust what you can see. Robert gestured to Grace, who'd gained back the weight. Starvation had stolen her coat, glossy now, her eyes clear. That cow survived conditions that should have killed her. She carried these calves through starvation, through infection, through a birth that stopped her heart. Those genetics aren't on paper, they're standing in front of you. Walker tapped something into her tablet. The dairy co-op requires DNA verification for premium pricing. Without that, I can't justify more than market rate. Market rate for premature twins. Moore walked closer to the fence, studying Star's clubbed foot, one of which has a significant conformational defect. The temperature climbed past 90, heading for the triple digits predicted by the morning news. Sweat darkened Robert's collar, trickled down his spine. He felt the sail slipping sideways, felt the careful preparation dissolving under the practical reality that without papers, without proof, these calves were just another commodity. The buyers huddled by Moore's truck, voices low enough that Robert couldn't make out words. 10 minutes of discussion while he stood with Dr. Taylor, both of them waiting, the sun beating down without mercy. Laura appeared from the house with a pitcher of sweet tea and plastic cups, an offering that felt desperate even as she made it. When the buyers returned, Moore's face carried professional neutrality. Mr. Williams, we've discussed it. I'm prepared to offer $18,000 for Aurora. She's a strong calf, good conformation, despite the premature birth. Robert's chest tightened. And Star 6,000, the clubfoot, significantly impacts her value. Even if the genetics are what you claim, she'll never show, likely won't breed true. The math assembled itself with brutal efficiency. 18 plus 6 equaled 24. $24,000 against a $38,000 debt meant $14,000 short. Even selling Grace for $3 wouldn't bridge the gap. Robert's mouth went dry, words sticking in his throat. That's $14,000 short of what I need to save my home. Moore's expression didn't shift. That's market rate for unverified genetics and a defect. Scott added, his voice not unkind. I'll match Moore's offer if you prefer. 24 total. That's fair pricing given the circumstances. Walker looked up from her tablet. The dairy co-op can't go higher without documentation. I'm sorry. Robert heard himself trying to negotiate, voice rising slightly with desperation he couldn't quite hide. 30,000 for both. That's below what Dr. Taylor estimated for healthy genetics. Moore shook his head. 24 is our offer. Take it or leave it. The silence that followed lasted maybe 5 seconds, but felt infinite. Robert saw everything unraveling, the ranch slipping away, despite Grace's survival, despite the calves arriving alive, despite every desperate measure they'd taken. 24,000 couldn't save them. 24,000 meant packing boxes and telling Jake they were leaving anyway. Jake's voice cut through the silence, small and clear. Mr. Moore, can I tell you something? Every head turned. The boy stood near the barn, too far away to have been part of the conversation, but close enough to have heard the offer. He walked toward the group with determined steps, chin up in a way that reminded Robert painfully of Catherine when she'd made up her mind about something. Laura moved to intercept him, concern crossing her face. Jake, maybe not Robert, stopped her with a hand on her arm. Let him talk. Jake walked straight to Donald Moore, the richest man in the county, and looked up at him without flinching. Do you know what happened to this cow? Moore's expression shifted to something between annoyance and curiosity. I know what Dr. Taylor told me, but do you know the whole story? Jake's voice stayed steady. She was at the Lubbock auction in June, skinnier than you can probably imagine, ribs you could count from across the barn. Everyone laughed at her. They pulled out their phones and recorded her and made jokes about how she wasn't even worth the cost of putting her down. The buyers listened, faces neutral, but attention caught. Robert wanted to stop his son, spare him this vulnerability, but Jake had momentum now and wouldn't be deterred. My dad walked up to that pen, and everyone laughed at him too, called him stupid for bidding, said he was hauling home a corpse. But he bought her anyway for $200, money we didn't have, money we needed for other things. Jake, sweetheart. Laura tried again, but Jake shook his head. He brought her home, and he stayed up every night in the barn making sure she didn't die. He spent money on feed we couldn't afford. He gave up his blood pressure medication so she could have supplements. When she got an infection, and we didn't have money for antibiotics, my sister drove home from Dallas and gave him her tuition savings. Scott shifted his weight, glancing at Moore. Walker had stopped typing on her tablet. Do you know why he did all that? Jake's voice cracked slightly, but held. Because nobody else was going to. Because my dad sees value in things everyone else calls worthless, just like he keeps seeing value in this ranch everyone says is dying, in this family everyone says is broke. The boy turned to look at Aurora and Star, both calves watching their mother, oblivious to the negotiation, determining their futures. That calf with the clubfoot, her name's Star. She fought to be born. She died and came back. She stands up even though it hurts because she doesn't know how to quit. Jake faced Moore again, and Robert saw tears tracking down his son's face, now silent and unstoppable. My mom died 6 years ago. Cancer. She's buried under that tree right there. This ranch is all we have left of her, and in 3 days, a bank is going to take it because we're $14,000 short of a debt we can't pay. The silence that followed felt different than before, heavier charged with something Robert couldn't name. Moore's face had changed, the professional neutrality cracking to show something underneath. Scott stared at the ground. Walker had closed her tablet completely. Jake wiped his face with the back of his hand. I know 24,000 is probably fair. I know papers matter and club feet lower value. But these calves are alive because my dad believed when nobody else did. And I just thought you should know that before you decide. The boy turned and walked back toward the house. Shoulders shaking with silent sobs he was trying to hide. Laura followed him, one arm wrapping around his shoulders, both of them disappearing through the door. Robert stood frozen, unable to move or speak, his son's words still hanging in the air like smoke. Moore removed his Stetson, wiped sweat from his forehead, put the hat back on. Mr. Scott, Miss Walker, could I speak with you for a moment? The three buyers moved to Moore's truck again, their voices low. This huddle lasted longer 3 minutes, maybe 4. Robert watched their body language, trying to read meaning in gestures and head movements. Scott nodded several times. Walker pointed at her tablet, even though it was closed. Moore did most of the talking, his hands moving to emphasize points Robert couldn't hear. When they returned, Moore's expression had shifted to something Robert couldn't quite read. Mr. Williams, we need to discuss something. Robert braced himself for the apology, the explanation that business was business and emotions didn't change market value. Here it comes, he thought. The gentle rejection that would precede them driving away with the same $24,000 offer, or maybe nothing at all. Ms. Walker, you want Aurora for your dairy co-op genetics program? Walker nodded slowly. Yes, I'll pay $15,000 for her. Robert's brain stuttered on the number. 15 was less than 18. The offer was going down, not up. He opened his mouth to protest, but Moore continued. Mr. Scott, you'll take Star Scott's voice came quiet. Clubfoot doesn't matter for my breeding program. I need genetics more than show confirmation. 8,500. 15 plus 8.5 equaled 23.5, even worse than before. Robert felt the ground disappearing beneath him, felt the final hope crumbling. They were lowering the offer, probably out of pity, which somehow felt worse than the original rejection. And I want Grace. Moore's voice cut through Robert's spiraling thoughts. Robert blinked, confused. Grace. A cow that survived what she survived, carried twins in her condition, birthed them, and lived. That's not just genetics, Mr. Williams. That's spirit. That's worth something. Moore paused. I'll pay $3,000 for her. The new math, 15 plus 8, 5 plus 3, equaled 26.5. Still, 11,500 short, worse than the original offer. Robert's hands clenched into fists, anger rising through the despair. They were toying with him, or worse, offering charity disguised as business. Mr. Moore, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm not finished. Moore's voice carried an edge, now something sharper than business courtesy. Your son reminded me of something my father used to say. He told me that value isn't always written on paper, that sometimes you have to recognize worth by what it cost to create. Moore looked at Scott, then Walker, Then back to Robert. "I'll pay 20,000 for Aurora. That's my final offer." The number hung in the air, impossible and real. Robert's breath caught. 20,000 plus 8,5 plus 3 equaled 31,5. Still 6,5 short, but close enough that maybe— Wait. Moore held up a hand. "I'm not done with Grace either. A cow with her genetics proven mother survivor of conditions that would kill most animals. She's worth more than 3,000 to my breeding program." Moore's face settled into determination. "I'll pay 10,000 for Grace." The new total assembled itself in Robert's head with crystalline clarity. Aurora, 20,000. Star, 8,500. Grace, 10,000, $38,500, 500 more than the debt. Exactly enough, with a cushion so small it barely qualified as margin for error. Robert's legs went weak. He reached for the fence rail, gripping it hard enough that wood bit into his palm. The numbers couldn't be real, couldn't work out this perfectly. But Moore was pulling a checkbook from his truck, and Scott was nodding, and Walker had reopened her tablet to process something. "I'll take Aurora at 15. Walker's voice carried finality. "Wire transfer initiated. Now, Mr. Williams, you'll have funds by tomorrow morning. Star's mine at 8,5. Scott extended his hand to Robert. "Cash or check, your preference. And Grace and Aurora come to Highwood Ranch." Moore's pen scratched across paper, the sound loud in the morning quiet. 20,000 for Aurora, 10 for Grace. 30,000 total. Robert took the check Moore offered with hands that shook so badly he nearly dropped it. The paper felt thin and insubstantial, too light to represent salvation. But the numbers were there in Moore's precise handwriting: $30,000 pay to the order of Robert Williams. "Why?" The word escaped before Robert could stop it. "Why would you pay more than market rate?" Moore settled his Stetson more firmly on his head, his face showing something that might have been respect. "Your boy there gave me a speech about seeing value where others don't. Made me realize I've been in this business long enough that I've forgotten how to do that. You saw worth in a cow nobody wanted. Seems only right I return the favor." He gestured toward the house where Jake had disappeared. "You raised a good son, Mr. Williams. One with character. That's worth more than any pedigree paper." Scott added his own voice quieter. "I grew up on a ranch like this, lost it in the drought of 2009. Understand what you're fighting for." The three buyers arranged logistics pickup, scheduled for August 15th morning, health certificates prepared by Dr. Taylor, transportation coordinated. Robert heard the words but couldn't quite process them through the ringing in his ears. $38,500, the ranch saved, Catherine's grave protected, the home preserved. When the buyers finally drove away, dust trailing their trucks down the long drive, Robert stood alone in the yard holding two checks and listening to his heart hammer against his ribs. Laura emerged from the house first, her face asking the question she couldn't voice. "We got it." Robert's voice came out rough. 38.5. They paid more than asking. Laura's knees buckled. She sat down hard on the porch steps, hands covering her face, shoulders shaking. Jake appeared behind her, his eyes red but hopeful. "Dad, come here, son." Jake ran to him, and Robert caught him in a hug that lifted the boy off his feet, despite 12 years of growth. You did this. Your speech made the difference. I just told them the truth. The truth was enough. Robert set his son down, keeping one hand on his shoulder. The truth about Grace, about us, about not giving up. That was enough. They stood together in the morning heat, the three of them holding on to each other, and the impossible reality that they weren't losing the ranch after all. That two calves born too early and too imperfect had somehow bought back their future. August 14th passed in a blur of preparation Robert barely remembered afterward. The contracts needed signing, the health certificates required, Dr. Taylor's verification, the transportation arrangements demanded coordination. But underneath all the logistics, one truth pulsed steady. Tomorrow morning, Grace and her calves would leave. Jake spent the full day in the pen sitting cross-legged in the dirt, talking to Grace in that quiet voice he used when he thought nobody was listening. Star had figured out how to nurse despite her clubbed foot, her determination outlasting the physical limitation. Aurora grew stronger, hourly, already, showing signs of the robust calf she'd become. Laura took photographs with her phone, capturing Grace with both calves, the oak tree's shadow, the light falling across Robert's weathered face. She didn't say why, but Robert understood. Some moments required documentation needed to be preserved against the forgetting that time inevitably brought. That night, after Jake had finally gone to bed, Robert walked out to the pen one last time. Grace stood in the moonlight, both calves asleep against her sides, her head up and alert. When she saw Robert approach, she moved carefully to the fence without disturbing Aurora or Star. Robert reached through the rails, placed his hand on her face, felt the warmth of her breath against his palm. Tomorrow you go somewhere better, somewhere with green pasture and clean water and all the grain you can eat. Grace's eyes caught the moonlight reflecting it back. In those eyes, Robert saw the full circle, the skeletal cow at the auction, the dying animal in his truck bed, the mother who'd stopped breathing and come back, the survivor who'd saved them all. Thank you. Two words that couldn't contain everything he felt, but they were all he had. For not giving up, for trusting me, for being exactly what we needed when we needed it most. Grace leaned into his touch, and they stood that way for a long time, man and cow, both of them, knowing this was goodbye. August 15th arrived with Donald Moore's trailer at 6 in the morning, professional transport, with padded stalls and climate control. Two ranch hands Robert didn't know loaded Aurora first. She walked up the ramp easily, curious and unafraid. Star took longer, the clubbed foot making her hesitant, but Jake's gentle encouragement got her into the trailer beside her sister. Grace resisted. She planted her feet at the ramp's base, muscles tensed, refusing to move. The ranch hands tried coaxing, then pulling, but Grace stood immovable as stone. Robert entered the trailer, called to her, "Come on, girl, time to go." Grace's eyes found his, and Robert saw the question there. After everything, the rescue, the care, the survival, was he really sending her away? The doubt and hurt in that gaze nearly broke him. He walked back down the ramp, put his arms around her neck, spoke directly into her ear. "You're going somewhere good, the best ranch in the county. They'll take care of you better than I ever could. Your daughters need you, and you'll be together." Grace trembled against him, her breath warm on his neck. Robert held her like that for 30 seconds, then released her and walked back up the ramp. This time, Grace followed. The trailer door closed with a metallic clang that sounded too final. Through the slats, Robert could see Grace watching him, her head turned toward where he stood. The truck's engine started. The trailer began moving. Jake stood beside Robert as the transport disappeared down the drive, dust rising behind it. The boy's face was wet with tears. He didn't try to hide. "She knew we saved her, right? She knew." Robert's own voice broke. She knew. The Redford Community Bank opened at 9. Robert parked his truck in the same spot he'd used during that desperate visit weeks ago, the elm tree providing shade that felt different now. He walked in carrying an envelope containing 2 checks and a money order, $38,500 converted to forms the bank would accept. Gary Young saw him coming, and something in the bank manager's face shifted. Not quite surprise, but close to it. Robert Williams. "I wasn't expecting." Robert placed the envelope on Young's desk, the action final and satisfying. "Payment in full for the outstanding debt, $38,000. Young opened the envelope with hands that shook slightly, examined the checks, verified signatures and amounts. When he looked up, his professional mask had cracked completely. "How did you— the cow I told you about?" "The pregnant one." Robert kept his voice level. "She had twins. I sold them." Young processed this information, his expression cycling through disbelief to understanding to something that might have been embarrassment. All of it, the full debt, plus 500. Robert watched the bank manager's face. "Which I'm using to pay back my neighbor's loan." The paperwork took 40 minutes. Stamps and signatures forms in triplicate official documentation that the Williams family ranch was free and clear. When Young handed over the final receipt marked "Paid in Full," Robert held it like a sacred text, proof against a reality he'd been certain would arrive. "I have to admit, I didn't think this was possible." Young's voice carried something between apology and respect. "The head office is going to be disappointed. They'll find another property to develop." Robert folded the receipt, placed it carefully in his wallet. "This one's not for sale." He drove straight from the bank to Edward Harris's property, the old man's place, small and worn after 5 years of living on Social Security and pride. Edward sat on his porch in a rocking chair that squeaked Parkinson's, making his hands tremble, but his eyes sharp as ever. Robert handed him $500 in 20s, the money Laura had withdrawn from an ATM that morning. "That's the $300 you loaned me, plus 200 interest." Edward stared at the money like it might bite him. "Rob, that's too much. I don't need— you gave me hope when I had none. That's worth more than $200. The old man took the money with shaking hands, his eyes wet. "You kept the ranch? We kept the ranch." Edward nodded slowly, his chair squeaking in rhythm. "Catherine would be proud." The words hit Robert square in the chest, validation he hadn't known he needed. "Yeah, I think she would be." 6 months passed, like pages turning in a book Robert had been too busy living to read. The ranch recovered with the weight of debt, removed new calves born from the remaining herd fences, repaired with money that didn't have to be stolen from other necessities, feed bought without calculating which bills could wait. Jake returned to school in September with new clothes and confidence that changed how he carried himself. The bullying didn't stop completely, but it lost its power. Trent Morrison tried once to resurrect the poor farm trash label, and Jake had looked him dead in the eye and said, "My family fought for what's ours and won." "What have you fought for?" Laura finished her nursing degree. In December, graduated 3rd in her class, despite the interrupted summer semester. She took a job at Amarillo Medical Center, 90 miles from the ranch, but close enough to visit weekends. The salary let her start paying back her student loans and send money home that Robert refused to accept, but she insisted on leaving anyway. February arrived with the kind of cold that made bones ache, temperatures dropping into the teens at night. Robert was in the barn repairing a gate when his phone rang, Donald Moore's name on the screen. "Mr. Williams, I need to tell you something." Moore's voice carried excitement barely contained by professional courtesy. "About Grace. Is she all right?" "She's more than all right. I had her DNA tested routine for my breeding program. The results came back yesterday." Moore paused for effect. "Your cow descends from Legacy's Promise." The name meant nothing to Robert. I'm not sure what Legacy's Promise was, a champion dairy cow in the 90s. Her genetics are worth upward of $100,000 on paper. Grace carries those bloodlines. The testing company verified it twice because they couldn't believe it either. Robert sat down hard on a hay bale, the phone pressed tight to his ear. 100,000 auroras already proving it. Moore's voice rang with satisfaction. "First lactation started last month. She's producing in the top 5% of my entire herd. That calf you sold me for $20,000, she's worth $35 minimum now, probably more. And Star Club Foot hasn't slowed her down. Scott called me last week, said she's one of his best breeding prospects. That supposed defect turns out it doesn't affect fertility or maternal instinct at all." Robert closed his eyes, seeing Grace as she'd been at the Lubbock auction skeletal and mocked worth nothing to anyone except him. Seeing her as she'd become mother survivor carrier of genetics nobody had recognized. The symmetry felt almost too perfect to be real. "Listen," Moore continued, "I want to offer you something. Visitation rights. Bring your family out to Highwood Ranch anytime you want. No appointment necessary. Grace is part of your story. She should stay connected to it. I'd like that." The words came out thick. "Thank you." March brought warmth that felt premature but welcome. Robert, Jake, and Laura made the drive to Highwood Ranch on a Saturday, the 3-hour journey, passing in comfortable silence and occasional conversation about nothing important. The ranch itself sprawled across sections of land that made Robert's 640 acres seem like a garden plot. Moore met them at the main gate, directing them to a pasture where Grace grazed with 20 other cows, all of them healthy and glossy in the spring sun. She recognized Robert's truck from 100 yards out, lifted her head, started walking toward the fence. By the time they parked and climbed out, Grace had reached the rail. She pushed her head through, seeking Robert's hand, the gesture unchanged from that first night 6 months ago. Robert placed his palm against her face, felt the warmth, the life, the vitality that had been impossible to imagine back in June. "You remember," his voice came soft, meant for her alone. "You remember everything, don't you?" Jake pressed himself against the fence, reaching through to touch Grace's neck. "Hey, Miss Grace, we saved the ranch, just like you saved us." Laura stood back, taking photographs again, capturing the reunion she'd probably known they'd need someday. Grace with her head against Robert's chest, Jake laughing as Grace nuzzled his hair. Robert's face weathered and worn, but carrying peace that had been absent for years. "She's happy here." Moore stood at a respectful distance, letting them have the moment. "Best decision I ever made buying her from you. Best decision I ever made was buying her in the first place." Robert didn't look away from Grace. Everyone said it was stupid. Moore smiled. Sometimes stupid and faith look the same from the outside. Difference is what happens after. They stayed until the sun dropped low, until Grace finally turned back to her pasture and the comfort of routine. The drive home passed quietly, Jake asleep in the back seat, Laura watching the landscape blur past. Robert drove with one hand, the other resting on the center console, mind full of thoughts he couldn't quite arrange into words. The yellow poplar had bloomed early that year, March warmth tricking it into spring ahead of schedule. Robert stood beneath its spreading branches on a Saturday morning, Laura and Jake beside him, all three of them looking at Catherine's headstone. Someone had placed fresh flowers there, probably Laura during a midweek visit Robert didn't know about. "We made it, Kate." Robert's voice carried across 6 years of absence, speaking to someone who couldn't answer but might still listen. "The ranch is ours again. Kids are okay. Grace and her calves are thriving." Jake stepped forward, touched the headstone with fingertips that had grown calloused from ranch work. "Mom, you should have seen Dad at the auction. Everyone was laughing at him, and he didn't care. He just did what was right." Laura added, her voice soft but steady. "He taught us that. How to see value where others don't. How to fight for what matters." The wind picked up, shaking the poplar's branches, sending yellow flowers drifting down like slow snow. They fell on the grave, on the grass, on Robert's shoulders, and caught in Laura's hair. Jake laughed and tried to catch one, the sound bright and young and exactly what this place needed. Robert stood silent, watching his children, feeling Catherine's presence in the way spring smelled, and the way light filtered through leaves, and the way his heart hurt and healed simultaneously. He'd kept his promise, saved. The land protected the family, refused to give up even when giving up looked like the only option. A yellow petal landed on his palm. He closed his fingers around it gently, then opened his hand and let the wind take it back. How often do we judge worth by what we see on the surface? How many miracles walk past us because they don't look like we expected? The question formed itself in Robert's mind without conscious thought, shaped by 6 months of reflection and 6 years of loss, and one skeletal cow that had taught him the difference between value and price. Grace had shown him that worth lived invisible inside, waiting for someone to believe enough to look. He thought about the people at that auction, phones out and laughter loud, seeing only ribs and weakness. Thought about what they'd missed, the genetics, the pregnancy, the will to survive that couldn't be measured in pounds or documented on paper. Thought about how close he'd come to walking past her too, to letting her die in that pen while he searched for something that looked more like the answer he expected. You ever take a chance on something everyone else gave up on? Robert didn't speak the words aloud, but they echoed in his head with the weight of testimony. Ever been the person everyone underestimated? The answer stood all around him in the ranch, still standing in the children, still hopeful in the grave under the blooming tree. Yes, he'd taken that chance. He'd been that person. And the ones who'd laughed that June morning at the auction, they didn't laugh anymore. They whispered his name now, the story spreading through Redford and beyond the farmer who'd bought a dying cow for $200 and turned her into salvation. Some told it as inspiration, others as luck. But Robert knew the truth that lived deeper than either interpretation. The same people who laughed today would whisper in wonder tomorrow. The same cow nobody wanted would mother a legacy worth more than anyone imagined. The same man judged as foolish would prove that faith measured in dollars never calculated the full sum. Robert walked back toward the house, his children following, yellow petals still falling around them like benediction. Behind them, Catherine's grave rested in dappled shade, the tree she'd planted, still blooming, still dropping proof that life continued even when everything seemed ended. And in a pasture 3 hours north, Grace grazed with her daughter, both of them healthy and valued and alive, proof that sometimes the thing you rescue ends up rescuing you back, and sometimes belief becomes its own evidence, and sometimes $200 buys more than livestock. Sometimes it buys hope, and hope, it turned out, was worth more than any price tag could measure.